Hello, I'm Bret. This is Matt. Hi, Matt.
Oh, hi.
We're live. Hopefully you're watching us live. And this is something we do every week. So if you're not watching this live, come back on Thursdays. We're live every Thursday now for many years and for years to come. So we're excited because this is going to be a great talk with a special guest. But before we get to all that, let's just break down what this is all about. This is a show that turns into a podcast, if you didn't know that. Matt and I will be speaking in your ears on something like Apple Podcast or Google Podcast or one of the many thousands now podcast players and networks. So all the links for that are below. You can find previous shows. All the shows are here on YouTube, but we edit them down into audio-only podcasts, and they show up in your favorite podcast player, Devops and Docker Talk. And then what else have we got? We have coming up my new course this year I'm excited about. This is all about GitHub Actions and Argo GitOps, so Argo CD. So it's the CI and CD together. You learn this in 2 weeks live. It's all live over Zoom. And unfortunately, this time Matt will not be there, but we're going to have lots of great people there, and you get to learn and collaborate with other students on the exact same problems that we're solving. So if you're looking to check out GitHub Actions or you're wanting to automate your deployments, we are signing people up now. Enrollment has happened. We just had 3 people sign up in the last couple of days, so get on the list because we're only accepting so many people. It's not going to be 100 people here. It's like 20 to 30, and it's going to be a great time. We just finished one earlier this year, and I already have new content, so it's already been updated. So check that out. Again, all the links below. And if you didn't know, this is also a Discord server community. So this little link above us, devops.fan, go check that out. We have over 14,000 DevOps professionals or people learning DevOps, everything cloud native, everything Docker, Kubernetes, which will be the topics of today. So go check that out at devops.fan. All right, let's get to it. So on the show today, we're very excited to have Brendan Burns from Microsoft. Hello.
Nice.
In case you didn't know who Brendan was, you don't recognize him maybe. He's been all over the internet for quite some time now. And in fact, before the show, my wife and I were watching some of the videos that all the interviews you've done over the years about the Kubernetes project. But if you didn't know, Brendan is the corporate vice president at Microsoft overseeing Azure Cloud Native and resource management. And before that, long ago, and this was a long time ago, it seems like in the internet years, you were one of the co-creators of the Kubernetes project. And now you're essentially running cloud native at Microsoft. So what's that all about? What do your day-to-days look like when you're running Azure Cloud Native?
Yeah, so I mean, it varies. I would say depending on the day. Yesterday I started out with like a intern talk. It's intern season, so we have interns coming in, and I sort of did the welcome and 101, and like you have to actually be like. It's funny because you spend. We've been doing this for 10 years, longer. And you realize, oh my gosh, I'm gonna actually have to sit people down and be like, okay, this is a virtual machine. Like this is how a virtual machine is implemented. Like there's all this detail that's just assumed, right? But like if you're coming straight out of college, I mean, hopefully they've kicked around the cloud a little bit, but maybe not. Especially if they're a junior, and they've had 2 years, maybe 2.5 years of courses. So it kind of gave them like a little bit of a 101, which was fun. I used to be a professor, so I like doing that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And then also the organization, the resource management part of it is actually all of the APIs and templates and the command line tools and the web portal for Azure all up, right? So probably half my life is actually in how do we do policy and access control and governance and user interface design and stuff like that for Azure, for all of Azure. And then the other half of my life is in cloud native and Linux, cloud native and Linux too, right? So like people who are doing what we would sort of call, I don't know if you call it legacy Linux or like I started a company before 2008 Linux, but like, J2ME or just not J2ME, J2EE on Linux style stuff. Where people aren't necessarily in containers. And it's a big org. It's about 1,000 engineers all up total. So there's a lot of just kind of like the nuts and bolts of running a large org. But also like trying to hack, and I think we're going to talk later about like WebAssembly and stuff like that. So I've been trying to kind of keep my finger in the cloud native community out in the open source land too. I maintain the Kubernetes clients for a bunch of different languages, Java and .NET and JavaScript, TypeScript. So that allows me to kind of stay connected without being mission critical.
Right.
And I know at a lot of big companies, you can progress through your career ladder and stay individual contributor versus switching over to the full-time manager. Are you? It sounds like
I'm a very full-time manager. Yeah, I'm a very full-time manager. I'm the pointy haired boss for sure. I think you can still, stay technical and still stay connected. But like, I think one of the things you realize at a point in your career is you have to figure out like how much impact do you want to have.
Yeah.
Okay? And if you want to have really, really, really big impact, I just don't think you can do it without, at some level, directing an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Sometimes that means you're, sort of more of a architect influence on it, or sometimes that means you're managing a larger. I don't really like the architect role personally. It just doesn't work for me. I'd rather be in charge, and I'd rather be responsible. Like, I think that I've always wanted to have the responsibility for the services that I'm trying to tell what to do, because otherwise it's very easy to like get astronaut architecty. Not saying that everybody does that, but like, it's very easy. Like, if your butt's not on the line, if people aren't, if customers aren't yelling at you when things fail, like,
yeah,
it's very easy to make a lot of like, you should do X without really understanding what it's like.
Yeah.
So,
and you mentioned right at the beginning, corporate vice president. How many of those are there? I mean, I
don't know.
It's not like
I don't
like
know.
one.
More than a few.
Yeah.
Enough to fill a reasonably large room.
Yeah.
I don't know. Hundreds, I would say. At Microsoft,
Yeah.
100.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And that spans engineering, and I mean, obviously it spans
Sure.
Xbox and Word and Office, and and then also into the field, in like sales field and all of that.
Cool.
So yeah, it's been fun. It's been a lot of learning.
How long have you been there?
Be a little over. It's 7 years basically right now.
Wow.
Yeah. So a long time. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable. You look back, you're like, oh, all
right. Slowly creeping up on a decade, which is so rare now. It's hard to keep up with my friends that are, especially the younger people, the ones without gray beards, that they're just hopping around so much. It
is the longest manager I've ever had. I've had the same manager for those 7 years, and like it is the longest I've had the same manager. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, especially if you like them.
Yeah, and it works out. I mean, it's good, and but like just that level of consistency. In fact, my reporting chain in general, all the way up to Satya, hasn't changed.
Oh wow,
so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah,
yeah. I think I learned 20 years ago, probably earlier in my career, that it was most of my happiness at a job was related to my boss, not actually what I was doing, and so I would try to pick my boss more than pick the position. And then of course, bosses don't always stay. So,
no.
I had one where 6 months later they were gone. So it's always hard to find a good boss and then stick with them. So, so, all right. So in the chat, for those of you in chat, I have put the request out there. So we've got Brendan here. The reason we do this live is to ask questions from the audience. So if you have questions as we go, we have a whole lot of topics. We could probably fill hours of discussion around containers and Azure. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in, and we'll try to inject them into the conversation as we go. I feel like maybe talking about, so a recent show we had, let me set this up a little bit, is talking about all the ways to run containers in the cloud, essentially. Mostly we were talking about AWS and that one, but I was very curious today because I started reviewing all the ways I could run containers in Azure, because I hadn't checked in a while, and it seems like we keep coming up. I'm just going to put that out there. It feels like the containers have won the cloud because we now have it seems like more ways to run containers on the cloud than any other type of workload, if you consider a container a single kind of workload. And in fact, I pulled up, just for reference, I'm going to throw this in chat. This wonderful little Azure help page that is basically saying, here's all of our container services. Let me help you. It's almost like Clippy asking me, hey, I see you want to run containers. Here's all the ways you can run containers on Azure. And I think a lot of us, especially those that are learning Kubernetes, we learn about Kubernetes on the cloud, so AKS. But I like to advocate for, and so this is sort of setting up the conversation for maybe some of your favorites or some of the ones you like to talk about. I like to talk about other ways that we can abstract. And so I think for years now, we've all been talking about what's the next abstraction on top of Kubernetes. And so I tend to recommend for people checking out Azure Container Apps first, in case they maybe don't need to go to the level of complexity of Kubernetes, and only get into Kubernetes if they think that they're going to need all of that level of complexity. How do you, if someone's coming to you and they don't necessarily have this pre-assumption of I need Kubernetes, do you how do you guide them through the decisions on where they run their containers?
Yeah, actually, we just at Microsoft Build, the conference this past month, we we gave a talk, and we are actually, I would say, we're trying to focus in a little bit. We're trying to this page is going to get updated soon, and it's going to focus in a little bit more on Azure Container Apps and the Azure Kubernetes Service as kind of the two ways that we would recommend people to start thinking about running containers. OpenShift is obviously a great solution for people who are in the Red Hat ecosystem and interested in that as well. And yeah, I think container apps is definitely that sort of platform as a service. I've got one or two containers. I want to spin them up quickly. I don't necessarily want to get, have it get in my way. I think that what we find is that there's a lot of value in the cloud native ecosystem, in the open source ecosystem. And a lot of that value is built on top of the Kubernetes API, right? And so it's almost as if and I think this is a challenge that we're trying to figure out how we sort our way through, right? Because it's like, I want the simplified experience for my own development, but I kind of need the complex experience so that a monitoring system or a database that I want to run can land in the raw Kubernetes cluster. And so I think what we're trying to figure out over time is, how do we actually deliver both of those things in the same place, right? Azure Container Apps is actually built on top of AKS. It's built on top of the Azure Kubernetes service. Right now, that's not necessarily exposed to the end user. But I think over time, what you're going to see is you're going to start exposing bits. So you can sort of say, well, for my app, I'll have a simplified development model, but I'll be able to kind of break glass down to the Kubernetes APIs when I need to. That's kind of the North Star that we're driving towards. Right? I think that the traditional problem with platform as a service has been that cliff of, right? Like I always said, you want the experience of leaving a PaaS to be kind of like firing the gardener as opposed to jumping out of an airplane, right? Like you fire the gardener. Well, what happens? Well, the next week, the grass gets a little bit longer and a little bit longer. And eventually you figure out how to use the mower, right? Like you jump out of a plane, like you got very little choice but to figure out how to fly on the way down.
Right.
And I think that's been the challenge, is that that sort of gradual descent into complexity versus the easy, hard has been the traditional challenge with PaaS platforms. And is actually, I think, why we continue to see so many people come into Kubernetes. Because no one's done a great job so far of building that bridge, building that sort of continuous connection between an easy to use experience on the one hand and this general purpose infrastructure on the other.
That's actually a really great topic, because I'm also a consultant, and I end up helping a lot of people that are coming out of my courses, and they're getting started on the Kubernetes and Docker train. Of course, that I'm seeing more and more of people that are they've been doing containers a while, but now they're finally adopting Kubernetes, or maybe they were adopting Kubernetes for maybe just test stuff or low risk environments, and now they're ready to go full in. And I agree with you completely on the we think of the Heroku style sort of, I don't need SSH for anything here, and I certainly don't need any low level CLI tools to manage it unless I want to do something like Terraform, but. And then there's suddenly there's one thing. There's that first thing that they can't do on that easy to use plug and play. If we're going to take it back a notch, plug and play platform. And then suddenly it's the depths of, now I need to know Kubernetes API. I need to know Kubernetes tooling. I need to write Helm charts. I need to blah blah blah. And it all rolls down really quickly for them as terms of, well, this is a much bigger ask than my previous experience. And I'd love to. That's got to be sort of a fascinating, hard problem, but a fascinating one once you are able to crack some of that nut, because that is what everyone I think is challenged with. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the sort of thing where if you'd asked me when we started, when would we have solved it, I would have said I don't know, a couple of years, we'll get there, right? So when we're approaching 10 years and we're still man, there's this problem out here. We're sort of starting to see, I think people are starting to sort of say platform engineering. That's kind of turning into a term that I think people are starting to talk about in terms of linking up, GitHub Actions to, a predefined Helm chart or a predefined YAML for deployment. Like you can start to cobble together something that looks a little bit like Heroku, but has the flexibility of Kubernetes underneath it. But it's certainly not codified, and it's certainly not like off the shelf. It's still, oh, take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'll plug this in here, and and it's interesting to try and figure out why, right? And the best thing that I can come up with and that I've thought about over time is that the high-level PaaS thing demos really, really well, right? So it's super easy to sell it.
Yeah.
Because you're like, look, in 5 minutes, I have a working at scale, auto-scaled application. Because none of the stuff that you talk about where you like hit that one thing comes up in the demo, right? And so it's really easy to sell, and it's not until much later that you realize, oh crap, like we should have built it in a way that was more modular and more decomposable. And the other approach is to build up from the bottom and to like build all these modular composable pieces. But for a while, that just looks like more complexity, because people are like, why are you trying to tell me about this like singleton service idea and this other idea? Because you have to necessarily like you're at the low level, you build the next level up, you build the next level up. Eventually you get to that pretty like it demos great world with modular composition. But the first couple steps don't really feel like progress. And so it's kind of hard to get people interested and excited and adopting and all of that stuff. And we made some scratches at it, right? I mean, I think the Dapper project that we've worked on for a while and continues to gain traction is probably one of the best steps along this continuum, where you can say like, okay, like let's make something like subscribing to a Kafka queue something that a developer really doesn't have to think very much about. Let's try and give them that sort of like functions as a service, event-driven webhook style programming model, but in a way that they can graft it onto maybe a legacy J2EE application or a legacy ASP.NET application. And I think that's really powerful, that kind of incremental adoption. So I think we're starting to see those pieces, but it's like building an operating system. And I guess that's the only other thing that I would say to give us a little bit of grace is that, let's say that operating systems started to exist in the mid 1960s. That's an ish, but mid 1960s. Like the modern operating system, I don't know when you want to place the date, but somewhere, I would say somewhere between, later versions of Mac OS and Windows 95. Right? I'd probably put it at Windows 95, right? So that's 1995, right? So 65 to 95, that's 30 years to develop the modern operating system, right? So we're 10 years into containers. Maybe we need a little bit more time also.
Yeah. Right? I mean, I still have people starting the Docker and Kubernetes courses that I sell every day. So yeah. It's, I mean, yes, there's a lot of people in university, but I still think that especially those of us that have been in enterprise tech and knowing that tech cycle is so much longer than what the rest of the industry. If you're on the tip of the spear, if you're working at a small team and you're able to adopt Docker before 2023, or maybe even 2020, you were relatively leading edge, or you were on the other side of the bell curve, and now we're like past that, and we're on the laggards, I guess you could say at this point. But there's a lot of laggards, and there's a lot. I think that's something that is sort of evident on this show, because we get people coming in that are asking the same questions that we were asked. We were talking about 7 or 8 years ago. I remember specifically like DockerCon 2019. I was talking with the event managers at the time, and that created the DockerCon, and we were talking about workshops and Docker 101s, right? Like, do we need a Docker 101? Do we need a container 101? And for those of us that are in, I guess I could say I'm in education now. Those of us that were teaching were like, yeah, you're always going to have that. Like, of course, like there's always going to need to be a Kubernetes 101. It's not like everyone is coming out of university and automatically has all these skills. Like we definitely need the 101s, but there's still a significant portion of those people that, I mean, even at KubeCon, right? We see half the hands raised or people that's the first time at KubeCon. Yeah. There's no stopping the onslaught of people that are doing maybe they're even doing container light. Maybe that's the term we use, container light. And it's Kubernetes is that next thing for them. And it's interesting that I guess what you're really talking about is that there's a new, we talk about abstractions a lot, and that Kubernetes, we're looking at all these other abstraction options now on top of Kubernetes. And is it what you're talking about, like these ideas that you're going to have to create in order to make the Kubernetes API maybe optional, is that you're going to have to create new things on top of that, and now we got to learn the new things first? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and the new things are going to kind of, I think that for a little bit, the new things add complexity.
Yeah.
Right. Unless you jump to the absolute top and you're like, web app is the new concept, right? But then you're building paths, right?
Right.
But if you start saying like, oh, okay, like we're going to introduce 15 distributed system concepts on top, as like the next level up from Kubernetes, so that instead of you saying like, hey, I've got a deployment, you say something like, hey, I've got a sharded application, right? Which has sharding in there. You're like, oh, like I could understand 10 replicas. Now you have to explain to me what sharding is.
Yeah.
Right. So like it simplifies things, because at some point you're going to need the sharding, and the fact that you can use it as a concept without implementing it is a good thing. But it also kind of, the jump in is a little bit more complicated, because it presumes you're designing a system, not just like, hey, you're running some stuff. And I mean, I guess that part of the analogy and then also it's just hard to figure out like what are the right models. I cast my mind back. I don't know, what you remember, but like there was a period of time when the DOS computer that I ran, the applications had the code compiled into it to run the mouse, right? Like it was like, oh, there's a serial port and the mouse has been plugged into the serial port. And when I launch, Microsoft Word, or when I launch whatever it is, like that app is actually talking to the mouse. There's no
like WordPerfect 5.1. I have this in my brain,
like
from mid 90s. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no like, and you had to like, is my app compatible with my mouse?
Right.
And at some point somebody had to sit down and be like, actually, no, we're going to have in the operating system this concept of a mouse, and this is the model, and all of the mice will fit into the model, and all the apps will talk to the model. And now we've abstracted the mouse away. And similarly with printers and network drivers and all the stuff, right? Somebody has to sit down and build those things and design them and convince everybody to adopt them. Right. And that's hard.
And one of the better analogies I've heard recently about that exact concept was something that actually you talked about on another presentation about declarative computing, and how you flying a plane when you were a kid versus your child flying a drone with an iPad, and how it's just I mean just easier now.
It's easier, and it's also getting some intelligence into the loop, right? So like and but I think with the mouse is a great example too, where you don't have to, you just get events, right? Like you no longer have to think like, keep checking with the mouse, keep checking. No, you just sort of say like, okay, when the mouse moves, you can even choose what kind of events. Do I want a double click event? Do I have like, even something like double clicking, actually, if you think about it, is hard. Like conceptually, as an app developer, you think, oh yeah, I want to respond if somebody double clicks. But like if you think about it in terms of actually pressing the button, what defines a double click? Right? Like how fast, how slow, like when is it 2 clicks? When is it, like someone had to go along and solve all that stuff. And then that empowers a bunch of developers to just use the concept. And I think that's kind of the stuff we're going through, which is what are the concepts we need? How do we define those concepts? And then how do we expose them in a way that developers know how to put them together into useful things? But it's taken way longer than I would have thought. And we don't have, and I guess the other thing that I find interesting, and I don't know what this says, I don't see us pursuing it with a lot of urgency. Like as a community,
right?
I guess is what I would say. We spend a lot of time being like, "Oh my God, it's so complicated," and like, there's this Simpsons at one point where like I think it's Flanders' dad is like, "We've tried nothing and we're out of ideas." Right? I kind of feel that way sometimes when I look at the community, where I'm like, okay, like you're saying a lot about how complicated this thing is, and yet I don't see us coalescing. And I guess you need someone to rally and drive the flag and stuff like that. And of course, it's solid 6 years between probably container ideas being in Linux and Docker popularizing those ideas. And I think frankly, without Docker, I don't know that it would have happened. It's not like it was set to happen. I think there is a lot of that coalescing and like driving the flag, but yeah, I don't know. Hard.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned Dapper. I just want to bring.
Oh, I lost your audio. I don't know if.
That was me. Yeah, right. I live near a jet base, so I get to deal with muting myself constantly through these shows. Nice. What a great idea to build a studio in your house that lives near a Navy base. Great idea. And Dapper, maybe not everybody's familiar with that. My understanding is you can actually use Dapper specifically on some of the Azure services, right? You want to describe that real quick for those that don't know?
Yeah, I mean, so actually Dapper is available on inside of AKS. It's available inside of Azure Container Apps just automatically if you want to turn it on. But it's worth pointing out that it really is not an Azure thing. It has a bunch of, we have this idea of a binding concept and a binding. So you'd say like a concept is PubSub and a binding is an implementation for a specific PubSub system. And so you as a developer can develop to the PubSub API and it will work with SQS, it will work with Kafka, it will work with event hubs, it will work with, other PubSub systems that are out there. And so, while I think we do a good job of integrating it into Azure, you want to run it on AWS, on EKS, and connect to SQS or connect to DynamoDB or any number of other services on AWS, like it will work great. And we have customers who are doing exactly that. And in fact, using it as a portable API, it's in some cases to like build applications that are truly cloud portable, even across different storage systems.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that there's a little bit of, sometimes we're talking about application deployment abstraction. Sometimes we're talking about maybe like cluster management abstractions. I feel like sometimes you can have something that does all or some different ideas that are separated. And I remember that years ago, there was this, I don't even remember who was running this Google Sheet, but it was a Google Sheet of like the 100 ways you can deploy apps on Kubernetes without writing Kubernetes YAML. I think it was specifically around application deployment. So maybe it didn't solve the entire problem of maybe abstracting out that thing. And for years, I was pounding the drum toward Docker because as Docker captains, I get a little bit of insider access. So I try to influence things the way I see them. And I wanted them to get Compose. There was a couple experiments on getting Compose as a deployment tool for Kubernetes. Never quite happened. There was a couple of iterations on different ideas and different things that are all now archived and don't exist anymore. And I remember there was a conversation at some point about how hard it was to take that simple idea of a YAML file and be able to encompass even 50% of what you would need to do on a Kubernetes platform, and that it would essentially just the Compose YAML format would end up being the Kubernetes YAML format, the manifest format. And so it was, I sort of accepted defeat that wasn't going to be the thing. It wasn't going to be one of the 100 on the list, I guess.
Yeah.
I've seen recently, I mean, Dapper definitely is a thing. I've seen Acorn from Darren Shepard and I don't know anything about it, but
HashiCorp has something. Lots of people have. Yeah. Everybody keeps trying.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's management.
It's the same problem, right? I mean, we have this thing called, we have a system called Draft that we worked, a project called Draft that we worked on that does the same kind of like bootstrappy kind of stuff. Everybody has their own take on it. It's the same issue, right? Which is how you do the really easy to use thing, but then how do you let somebody gradually see the complexity? Because people can't live in the easy to use thing forever. Like if people live in the easy to use thing for forever, it's Heroku or it's whatever your favorite PaaS is. Right. And we already had that discussion, right? So like again, like you have to figure out like how do you gradually let the complexity in?
Right. Sane defaults. How do you make sure that the defaults are there? That You don't have to see. That's, I mean,
Yeah.
Kubernetes technically does that. Like if we'd have done a really hard mode, right, that the manifest would have had to been explicitly defined for every value. And boy, can you imagine that world? So I mean, I feel like to a certain extent, I came from the sysadmin background, so a lot of this stuff when we talk about deployment complexity, pipelines and systems management, I'm just thinking, look, I don't know why we're all unhappy, because it's still better than it's ever been. But it's interesting that you're talking about the will to solve this problem doesn't maybe it's almost like we needed a break from the attempts, and maybe who knows, maybe someone out there listening maybe can start the will in the company and find the funding and do all those things in order to iterate over an idea that solves the 80-20 rule sort of for Kubernetes. Yeah, it's an interesting problem.
Or be happy solving certain problems, right? Like I think there's some things, like you look at like monitoring, and I think monitoring is still hard in terms of defining the right things, but like in terms of the Prometheus scrape format, and so like it's just done. Like nobody's going and messing with like that ship has sailed, right? For that specific vertical area, I think. And maybe that's just what we need to do is build up enough of these like single focused things that you can build a system out of them. But then somebody still has to kind of stitch them together.
Yeah.
The thing I'm really looking for from your audience, I think, is the lamp stack moment, right? Like
we still talk about it. Yeah.
What is the acronym and what is the pieces, right? Because I think the thing that was great about LAMP is that it was kind of like, it was a philosophy, but it's also kind of loose, right? So people could be like, oh, the M is MySQL, but actually it's going to be Postgres, or actually it's going to be SQL Server. But you kind of still could squint at it and know how you're supposed to put things together. Yeah. Or they'd be like, it's not really going to be PHP. It's going to be ASP.NET, but we can squint at it. And I feel like we don't have that for Kubernetes, right? Like there isn't that like the opinionated stack.
Right.
Yeah. So, well, we definitely have opinionated stacks, but it's certainly not a consensus on which one.
Right. Yeah. And it's not a loose consensus. It's not a loose consensus, because I think I feel like the great thing about LAMP was that it was a loose consensus. Like nobody was going to be like shouting you down in a DevOps meeting because you were using something that wasn't PHP.
Yeah. And you're right. Like it was composable to a certain extent that you could implement, the LAM and skip the P, put in, gosh, back then it might have even been classic ASP. Do you remember that?
Yeah, classic ASP, Cold Fusion. You remember Cold Fusion?
Yeah. I actually spoke at a Code Fusion conference like 4 years ago. Like it's still a thing. It's not called Code Fusion anymore, but it's hilarious how things, typically in tech, they just don't die. They stop being talked about, but they're still there. We actually had a question. I want to change the subject real quick. Well, not necessarily change it. I wanted to ask you, I mean, we can't have a show in 2023 without talking about AI or even mentioning the word. But we had a little bit of a question around AI. I'm going to ask it a different way. Do you see, when we're talking about this infrastructure deployment and all these other, so you can hear my jets, do you think that there's an opportunity there, or do you see anyone working on a way for AI to maybe reduce that complexity by maybe making some of the decisions for us? You see anything out there that you could predict?
I mean, predicting is always a dangerous sport, but we did actually have one of the folks on my team built this Kube Control AI plugin. So you can actually now say Kube Control AI, deploy me in Nginx, and it will just do it. So I think that's interesting. It's experimental. I mean, that's all experiments rather than anything else. But I think there's some interesting things there. I think that the places that I'm actually more interested in looking at AI actually has to do with like summarizing complexity. So I think the generative stuff kind of captured everybody's like the novel generative stuff kind of captured everybody's imagination, and I think tools like GitHub Copilot actually are really fantastic at some of this stuff. But I think that the other really exciting area is, imagine you're woken up in the middle of the night, you're coming into your cluster, and you could get a 1-paragraph summary of what's going on in your cluster. Right. I think that kind of like, let me snap me up to date, get me up to date. We see this in Teams too, where Teams has features where, you can join a meeting 30 minutes late, and it will just like give you the summary of what everybody's talked about for the previous 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think that's the area that I'm particularly excited about, because I think that's the harder part of it. I mean, the learning curve is there, but like once you get over the learning curve, it's not that bad. Whereas like the summarization of complexity is just like an ongoing perma problem.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of like what AI can do for this kind of area, anytime I use ChatGPT to say create a manifest for Kubernetes to build, I don't know, some Nginx thing, the first answer is wrong. I mean, it makes up stuff that just doesn't exist, or it just doesn't work. And so it requires that conversation to go back and forth to like narrow it down and like get it just right. And maybe we don't have to have that conversation as a human, but maybe it's the policies. I think in another talk I saw you talk about guardrails and some of the intelligent, or some of the rules that I think you guys are defining, or other people are defining, and maybe that's that conversation that the AI has with the policies, and then comes up with that right, I don't know, something along that route.
Yeah, I think that notion of like giving the constraints and asking AI, like, give me an Nginx configuration. Okay, is that Nginx configuration compliant with my security policies, or something like that? I think those are pretty effective ways to do it. I think it's always going to be that mix of like I guess OpenAI is calling them skills, I think, and other people have called them other things, but that way of like plugging in stuff to the system so that it knows like, oh, I can do this thing over here. I don't have to sort of a priori create it from the things that I've learned. I can just harness, that particular skill. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think, I mean, the other place, this is not like LLM stuff, but we continue in all of my live site services we're heavy users of things like anomaly detection and that kind of stuff that can predict differences in low volume metrics, right? Like I think one of the things we've seen as we've continued to see the broad adoption of Kubernetes is that the environments get more and more complicated and more different from one another. And of course, we deliver for a lot of different enterprises, and they have very different, let's say, network security requirements. And being able to detect like, oh, actually that code change breaks everybody who uses Palo Alto filtering devices or whatever it happens to be, which might be 2% of our cluster population, but if every single one of them breaks, that's an anomaly, right? That kind of stuff for noise reduction for our on calls has been huge.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask this question. I thought this was an interesting one as a slight subject change here. On Q's on here with the always the good questions, always bringing the good questions. There's some kind of DevOps fatigue with devs nowadays. When I look around the internet, how could DevOps and Kubernetes community work against that or improve the feeling of fatigue? I mean, it maybe coincides with the whole, some of the platform engineering is marketed as the end of DevOps, which is really then you actually listen to it and then you're like, yeah, they're not saying that, they're just trying to get a headline. They're actually very pro DevOps. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I talked a lot about, and you can see this in a variety of different talks that I've given, is this notion of separation of concerns as being the true goal of DevOps. And I'm not sure that I don't know that anybody ever really implemented it. Like, I think people said DevOps means dev's own operation, and it's sort of like, well, did that actually mean that the dev should be responsible for upgrading the OS? Like, probably not. Right. And I think that we just didn't have the tools in some sense to separate things out enough so that you could say, because I don't think any developer has fatigue for ensuring that the code that they wrote is reliable. Or at least if they do, then they shouldn't be in the services business. Right. Like, I think the fatigue comes from doing either the same thing over and over again. So a lack of automation, which is a culture thing ultimately. You have to make sure that you're driving that culture of automation, or from the fact that you're like debugging stuff that isn't really your fault, right? Like you're like, I'm
Right.
down in this service mesh. I don't want to understand the details of how IP tables works. I just want my damn application to talk to my other application, right? And I think that's because, you know, we haven't done a great job of establishing ownership at the various different layers and saying like, okay, well, you're the DevOps for your app, but somebody else will be the DevOps for the service mesh, and that service mesh is part of the platform. It's part of the, like, there. By the way, to the platform engineering people, just because you're the platform engineering team doesn't mean you get to get out of the on-call, right? Like that's also really important, and I think something that people also don't always like. You are delivering a service. You're just delivering a service for other developers. And I think if you do that and you do that in the right ways, then like you get over some of this fatigue. But also, I mean, I do think that we have to be honest with everybody, and I think this is probably also one of the challenges that I've pushed really hard in my own org. You got to be really honest with product managers that you're going to spend a lot of your time doing like live site stuff. Like you're going to spend a ton of your engineering cycles on what smells like operations. Mm-hmm. That's just the reality of services, right?
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes we do a bad job reserving enough capacity to do that, right? We're like, no, we're like, it's gonna, like, we can squeeze it in. I'm on call this week, but I can still get that feature done. And like that's just not reality, right? Like you and so I think that's also where the burnout comes from, is that we as, whether it's product leaders or organization leaders or business leaders or whoever it is, we have to be really, really explicit about saying like we actually need to reserve a ton of capacity just for keeping these things running. Right?
Yeah. There was that moment where, and this is very team specific, but that moment where the manager saw that we were technically one part of DevOps, we were a little bit successful in giving the devs the ability to do some ops, which was the part of the failure of 30 years ago, was that the devs couldn't. Like, it was a wall. It was a virtual wall, or maybe the physical wall of the data center. The devs couldn't even get in there to talk to the operators because they didn't have the access to the data center. And we gave them those tools, and then maybe someone took it too far and then fired the ops person.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to a certain extent, it's like, I feel like we're successful, but maybe we dial that back a little bit. I mean, of course, being the ops person, I'm always very pro ops and always trying to encourage teams to not take it for granted and to not try to just bundle it on as a part-time job to the rest of the devs and saddle them with that. But you're right that there's also there's that fatigue. I've never met a consultant client. Of course, this is my worldview because people come to me for help, and they don't come to me for help and they don't need the help. So I've never met a client that couldn't optimize their systems. Like they had fully automated deployments. They had fully automated on-call processes that automatically evaluated clusters and helped you troubleshoot and gave you quick answers, and had a full diary of all the documentation and the change and the exact level of changes across all repos, because they're doing GitOps everywhere. Like, no one's really ever done that hires me. So whenever I hear that, and I don't hear that a lot, but I do sense it a lot of times with teams that have developers. So for unsecured there, the great question. I agree with you. I see that sometimes, but it's usually those teams that are driving that 15-year-old monolith Rails app that haven't adapted to anything, and they're still provisioning manual machines in the cloud for all things. They're still managing everything themselves. They don't have automation. They haven't changed their ways in 5 to 10 years. And I think that's probably, like Brendan's saying, I feel like that's more of the symptom of the culture change problem that you maybe need to have. So yeah, let's ask the internet that, right? If we've heard it on the internet, let's go ask the internet if that's the real case.
Yeah.
Regarding being on call, do you ever still take the pager to be on call, or what kind of problem needs to happen for you to get a call?
Yeah, no, we do have we call it the executive incident manager on call. And we're on call to, sometimes we have times when teams need approval to do a faster push than usual, right? So we have a safe deployment policy where we say, like, you have to have a bake time in the region and then move on to the next region, and low traffic and high, a mix of these different regions. And sometimes, the team is like, look, it's a 2-line change. We're highly confident and it's having lots of impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but in order, because obviously, every dev believes that their change is going to work perfectly. Someone needs to check the box to say, yeah, I approve that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll get
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's around customer engagement around an issue, right? They want
Mm-hmm.
someone who either quite honestly, sometimes they're just looking for somebody with a title.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes they're just looking for someone who's had a little bit of experience working, talking with a customer and explaining it at the right level. I think sometimes, the on-call engineer needs to be fixing the problem, but may not be the right person to explain it to a customer who maybe doesn't understand all the different layers in the stack. So it's usually that kind of stuff. We're fortunate that we generally do 12x7. And in Azure in general, we push really hard to do 12x7. Not everywhere, but we're getting increasingly good at having people around the world so that we can do follow the sun, which makes a huge difference sort of in people's lives.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I would have, if you've asked me to answer that, I would have assumed no, he's not on call. But that's actually really cool. I'm impressed with that. That's neat.
You're reminding me that I should go check when I'm going to be on call next and make sure it's not during a vacation. I caught Christmas week, by the way. For the last 2 years, I've caught Christmas week, Christmas to New Year's.
Uh-oh. Yeah. Someone likes you. That's why.
No, it's actually good though, because actually nobody's working, so nobody's pushing code, so stuff breaks.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah. Yeah. It's a more, especially around I guess maybe Black Friday is more of the
people
sales
freak out more.
period,
people definitely freak out more when bad stuff happens, but because actually Christmas Day is really huge for people like Xbox. As people unbox the Xbox and boot it for the first time and play the new game or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
That's an excellent point.
That's a pretty critical day for Xbox.
I have Diablo 4 sitting over here on Xbox that's waiting for me to play later today.
Exactly. Well, I've been all over Tears of the Kingdom actually, which is not.
Nice.
I'm not on brand, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's cool. Haven't played that one yet. I'm going to switch subjects real quick. Eric showed up earlier. Hello, Eric. Eric Smalling asks, would love to hear your thoughts on server-side WASM. So this was actually one of our topics, as it's increasingly, it's got its own day now at KubeCon, where we've got WASM Wazi Day or whatever the WebAssembly Day, whatever the version of those acronyms we want to use. We had a show, so we've had to set everybody up. We've had shows on this in the past. I actually did a talk. It's all on this channel. So if you search WebAssembly in this channel, you will find other videos. There's probably stuff that's happened in this year that I'm not aware of. But let me set you up real quick, Brendan. The WebAssembly is not new. It's been around for years. It was in the browser. And then at some point, someone thought, well, what if we could run this outside the browser, right? And I've explained it several times on the show before, so those of you that are new, there's this WASI WebAssembly systems interface, which helps us run WebAssembly apps without a browser on a machine. And those of us in cloud native decided to say, well, if that means if we can do that, then let's see if we can run it in a container. And fast forward to today, now you have, I'm just going to pull this up. Now you have ways to run WebAssembly on Kubernetes in Azure, which I believe you were the first cloud to do it, right?
We were definitely the first. And I think still the only. I think we might still be the only, but I'm not positive about that. But you can do it in other clouds. You can do it in other clouds, but I'm not sure it's a supported, documented part of
right.
What you...
Yeah, and it sounds like you'd probably have to roll. This is where when we get into the weeds of this, we're talking about a different runtime that has to be installed on the servers. So that would mean that if you're doing it on a different cloud, you definitely have to handhold your deployments.
Or take your WebAssembly and package it as a container and then just run the container.
Yeah. Cheating, I call it.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you have a state of WASM right now? Do you have any updates that have happened this year on Azure or otherwise?
I think the big thing that I've been involved in this spring, has been the development of the HTTP spec for WASI. which allows you to both make outgoing HTTP connections and also do some HTTP serving, and actually had the opportunity to implement that as well for WASM Time, which is the Bytecode Alliance's, one of the Bytecode Alliance's runtimes for WASM, and that's actually shipping now in the most recent release. So that's kind of cool because like I started playing around. We've been doing a bunch of this work, and one of the things that I think has come up a lot is, well, isn't this just the JVM again, or isn't this just the CLR? Like, isn't this just whatever your favorite virtual machine, language agnostic virtual machine is, right? And I think there's some important differences, but also I think it's an important critique, right? So I think the important difference is, an opt-in security model where by default you can't do anything, and then people add capabilities in. So like that's something that's different. And then also the fact that it was sort of language agnostic from the beginning is also a little bit different. But at the same time, I think that like if we just re-implement POSIX APIs inside of a virtual machine, I'm not sure we're really gaining the most bang for the buck. And this is an ongoing debate, I would say. I don't really speak for the WebAssembly community. But my feeling is like most people don't care about things like sockets. They want to make web calls. Like I was actually just talking to some networking people a while ago, and I was like, look, just like nobody cares about sockets anymore. Because 99% of what everybody does is some sort of HTTP RESTful call, or it's a gRPC call over HTTP WebSockets, right? And so I think that the opportunity that WebAssembly presents that's interesting is an opportunity to maybe redefine what the system interface is. And so in general, we've been working on kind of figuring out like what is the kernel binary interface for cloud-based workloads. And like we had this again at Microsoft Build, we had a discussion of like the future of programming languages, and I said, and I think maybe a little bit to provoke a conversation, but I actually kind of mean it, like, why do we care about files? Like, why does anybody care about files anymore? Because I would argue that like actually really nobody should care about files. Like it's just not a concept that anybody should really care about.
It's almost like having the ability gives us bad habits. It's like,
yeah,
because I can access the file system, I'm going to write files.
Yeah, and this isn't like the 12-factor, like, because I mean I think some of this stuff came out in the 12-factor manifesto, but because I'm not saying like I don't necessarily want local state is good, right? There's reasonable, valuable stuff you can do with local state, but at a programming perspective, should I really be interacting with it as a stream of bytes? Like it just kind of doesn't make sense. And I think that's one of the opportunities that WebAssembly presents, is to say like actually maybe we can develop a programming model that is a little bit more oriented around the kinds of ways that people are programming today, right? I think if you look at Linux or you look at any operating system, really, the concepts that the operating system exposes, they're ancient concepts. They're concepts from 30 years ago. And they're concepts that they were built for single machines, right? Like the person who developed the idea of POSIX was really not thinking about distributed systems, right? Network, yes, sort of ish, like, but not distributed systems, and certainly not like event-based systems, right? So like why, if you think about making a call, like if you think about receiving an event from a mouse, why is it so different, the programming model of receiving an event from a mouse than receiving an event from a Kafka queue, right? And people try and sort of like smush it together with a bunch of really thick client libraries and things like that. But like at some level, those things are operating system level. Like receiving an event from a pub sub mechanism, a cloud pub sub mechanism, that's an operating system level concept at this point, in my opinion. But we don't expose it that way right now. Similarly, like with reliable key value store, right? Like reliable key value store should just be an operating system level concept. And whether it's how that happens, who cares, right? Like mostly I don't care.
I like it. I think that's the containers. One of the successes, or one of the reasons that I consider sort of why did containers, why did Docker just take off? I mean, there's lots of reasons. We could talk about that at a different show. But one of the things that it did that so many other paradigms in tech didn't do was it brought everyone with it. Like you can take an 80s app and you can put it in a container and it will function. I mean, maybe it's not even network aware because it's sold as pre-TCP/IP and it didn't really. You can still run that into containers as long as Linux can run it. It can run. And that, to me, I mean, watching the huge amount of monoliths coming into containers, and what it meant to me a lot of times was it brought all the bad habits with it. And so, we always talk about, I mean, early days containers when everybody was worried about, will my app work in containers? I think it was like PayPal that did 700 apps or moved 700 apps into containers without a single line of code change. And these things are all true, and I'm so glad you mentioned 12-factor because these things were all true if you followed a lot of the 12-factor principles of you don't hard code things in your code, you abstract your environment away from your application code itself. And so, but containers allowed us to continue that. You could hard code file writing and reading. You could do all this stuff with bad behavior. You could bind mount the entire system in if you really wanted to. You could run it as privileged as a root level application. You could. I have clients that their container apps control system D on the bare metal OS. I mean, there's just so many. There's nothing you can't do really. And I love the idea that, maybe at its worst case, maybe the file system abstractions of WASI or it's an add-on, it's a plugin or something. Like maybe it's not out of the box by default, but we almost make it harder for people. But at the same time, we all want more those of us I think that are on the WebAssembly fanboys, whatever, fan club, sure. We want people to use it, and the more barriers we make to using it, so it's a double-edged sword. It's like, well, I want more people to try this out. I love the idea of my goal for once I learned what really WASI was going to do for WebAssembly, my goal was like, I want to be able to set up a Kubernetes cluster, and when I do, it automatically installs the runtime for WebAssembly, and let's all hope that it's a future where they're all mostly compatible, or I at least can help decide which one I'm running at which time. Like I can see a world where we maybe have 3 or 4 different ones on your cluster. But I was wanting to be able to have nodes where you can run Linux containers and WebAssembly containers side by side. You can, maybe someday there are actually 2 different containers in the same pod. Who knows how that's going to work? But it gets really. I'm just imagining a future where you, the developer, decide you want to use WebAssembly as your compiled runtime. I, as a system operator, don't even have to care anymore. And you don't have to care because we still have that container abstraction. And we still can just say, you're just shipping me a container. My container, we all actually, that I think about it, we all, with Kubernetes, we just assume the platform is Linux / AM, let's say AMD right now, AMD 64. We assume that for the longest time. And
getting
then,
better, but
and then we started to realize, we need to now support Linux / ARM, right? Like, because now M1s and Gravitons and all these different things. And I love that that's exposing people to the multi-platform idea, because I feel like that's the predecessor to WASI-WASM. Like that we're now going to add a third platform to our clusters, and we're going to be able to run this third type of container that, as long as the sysadmin or the cloud has set it up correctly, it just works. Do you see that? Do you see that future? Is that happening, or is that already here and I'm just now catching up?
No, I mean, I think it's definitely out in the future, right? But I think we are seeing it as sort of a runnable, pluggable thing. And I think that's the other opportunity, which is I think it allows us to potentially say, hey, we're going to actually deploy most of the system for you. Like as an administrator, I'm going to deploy, the sharding for you or the caching for you. And I'm just going to insert your little chunk of logic into the middle of the distributed system that I've kind of set up for you. And I think that is, that's the other real opportunity is to, you can think of systems that have done this in the past, like Hadoop would be a great example. Hadoop, you could give it a couple Java classes and it would build this massive distributed system for you. I think that the opportunity to say, like, well, what if Hadoop hadn't been so tied to the Java ecosystem? What if you could have basically said, like, I'm just going to give you this WebAssembly binary and it'll do MapReduce for you based on the WebAssembly binary. I think that's the opportunity that we're looking at. And beyond MapReduce, I mean, MapReduce has come and gone, and Spark is here and all that stuff. But like, there's other patterns like that you could build out with this sort of little pluggable chunk of user supplied compute. So I'm hopeful that's where we're going to head. Again, I think going back to the earlier conversations, we need a bunch of people who want to go and build it, or we need a lot of pain in the system. And I think the challenge that we have is we're having challenges rallying enough people, and we're having challenges finding the pain where it's not just sort of good enough. Painful but good, and painful but good enough. Right?
Yeah,
like that's like they say, whatever, perfection is the enemy of the good. I think that like painful but not quite painful enough is sort of the enemy, is the enemy of the good.
Right.
Tolerable is the envy of the good.
So different topic, but Linux distributions, they've had LTS versions for a long time, and AKS offered LTS releases in April or so of this year.
KubeCon.
Why did it take so long for a vendor to do this, and what are the implications of doing this?
Yeah, I think the idea of an LTS has been in the Kubernetes community for a really pretty long time. And I don't remember exactly when people started talking about it, but I bet it was 2 to 3 years after the creation of the project. I think RBAC came first. In terms of enterprise concepts, I think RBAC came to Kubernetes first, but LTS was shortly after proposed. I think it was, you can look back across the history and just sort of see why they kind of all fizzled. There's complexity there. Nobody, like, the reason you pay for an LTS isn't because like you are happy. It's because like it's hard work, right? So you want to pay somebody for not. So I think that you shouldn't shortchange the fact that it's hard work. And that's probably part of it, is that people are, but I think one of the things we saw was there's just a bunch of customer pain, especially, sort of mentioned earlier that the breadth of the market is coming to Kubernetes and has come to the Kubernetes in the last couple of years. As you see people like financial services or other like very regulated industries coming to AKS, and we just saw a ton of customers for whom certification of a platform could almost take as long as the lifetime of a Kubernetes release. Yeah. Right. And so they're almost like literally certifying a platform just in time for it to be deprecated. Yeah. And that was the customer pain that really drove us to say, like, look, we have to go do this. Right. And we'll bite the bullet in terms of like the investment of engineering resources to make it happen. But at the same time, we very much want the community to come along. Right. And so it wasn't going to be like, oh, we're going to keep the patches ourselves, and it's just going to be an Azure effort. It was like, we want to actually galvanize the LTS community in the Kubernetes community to produce a true LTS in the Kubernetes community. And the best way that I could figure out to do that was to basically say, like, look, we're going. Here's where we're going. This is what we're doing. Come party with us if you want to come. And I think we've seen that start to happen, and we've seen the knob started to turn there. In some sense, I think it's a little bit like what Darren did with K3S, right? Like, he was kind of like, look, I'm going to go do this small form factor thing, and I'm going to do it in my own, like, I'm just going, and here's the patches, and like, and I think that it was controversial at the time, and I think it still has some controversy in it, but ultimately it's what it took to move the Kubernetes community to start thinking about these edge devices and these edge environments. And I think it's similar with LTS. It takes someone who's willing to stand up and just be like, look, we're going, and this is what it'll look like. And let's, like, because the community can have some analysis paralysis sometimes, where people are like, oh, it's hard, and I don't exactly know, and have you thought about this, and what about that, and like, once you get somebody who's willing to dive down and say, like, actually, we're going to go solve some problems, and then the rest of it, we'll worry about it when we hit it, then suddenly you galvanize a lot more energy around it. So we're excited to be leading there, but I'm certainly hopeful that it turns into a true open source community thing instead of just an Azure thing.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up, the LTS stuff. So I live in one of the biggest military complexes in the U.S. I have 12 military bases in my area. Docker would always have this conference. It was the Fed Summit, essentially, up in D.C. that I would always go and present at. And these were early days. This was like people in government in 2017, 2018, maybe even 2019. Phil Estes was there. A lot of people that live in Virginia that are a part of the container community would go up there to speak or whatever to government employees. And it was always the very typical, what would you imagine the questions would be of either a large enterprise or a government agency, of like accreditation, certification, update cycles were a huge concern. I remember at some point, I have to sneak a swarm statement into the show. No one's asked a swarm question. That I remember specifically a conversation about adopting Kubernetes, and there was a lady from, I'm going to forget the agency, but they weren't accredited, they weren't approved to run Kubernetes yet, but they were approved for the Docker daemon. And so I was telling her on the side, I was like, Swarm's built in. You could just do Docker Swarm init, and then you would technically have some orchestration. You could, because she needed to run a tool that was high availability or whatever. And I was like, we can get, because we had just got done having a Kubernetes conversation on stage or whatever, and we're like, well, until you get Kubernetes, there's this little thing. It's, if your code is approved, the code's approved. So I definitely know those struggles of people that want to use it but maybe can't. They can't even get permission to because of accreditation or certification. Yeah. So the WASM stuff, I feel like we could have another show about WASM. We talked about a lot today. I want to get one last thing, and it's dealer's choice. So I know we didn't cover the entire list of topics that I had in there, and that's fine. We're not trying to make this a 3-hour podcast. But is there anything else that you're excited about, you're working on, that you wanted to maybe bring up? Anything container related? I mean, we did have a question of the standard. It's a great question, but it was often a question of what's after containers, what's after orchestration, what's the next thing?
I think the next thing, we'll shout back, and this is the thing that I'm excited about, which is, how do we build this modularized, easier to use developer system on top of containers? How do we use, we still don't have expressed in Kubernetes or anything else that I've seen, distributed system concepts. I feel like what is I think one of the great examples, I think, is like, imagine you have a web system. You've built a simple web server, replication, load balancer, all that stuff. You want to add caching to that. Just varnish, memcache, some not very smart HTTP cache. If you think about the amount of work that you have to do to use that idea, it's shocking in my mind, right? Literally, it should be a one line that says, I want this thing to be cached, and maybe cached, and here's my TTL. And we're nowhere near that. I want to see us work harder on solving some problems like that, because some of them are hard. I think maybe like the LTS, some of them are hard, and so you think about oh, I can't quite design the perfect thing. But there's some of them, like caching, that are just really easy, not complicated, could benefit a lot of people. And I feel like as a community, we need to do a better job saying, building the equivalent of sorting, right? If you imagine, if you had a developer who was working for you, and they came to you and they were like, hey, look, I re-implemented heap sort so that you can sort integers. You'd be like, why did you spend a day doing that? But we don't work with the distributed systems. People are constantly reinventing all this stuff, for no good reason. So that's my call to action, I guess. It's let's as a community, let's go figure out how we actually move the state of development forward. Because you're just not doing it today, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it's the will. Back to the do we have the will to do it?
Well, the will or the marketing. I don't know. It's both, probably, right? Someone has to figure out crack the code on getting people excited.
Yeah.
Right. How do you get people from Docker 0.1 to Docker 0.3, or from Docker 0.1 to Docker 0.8? That's the hard part, right? What comes after the 0.7 or the 0.8 is actually, it's a different kind of work.
Yeah.
That requires some real storytelling, right? Because people have to say, oh, wow, that thing is going to solve this problem that I have.
Yeah.
So
I like it. Well, thank you so much, Brendan. Again, I guess like I say this 100 times, we could be talking for 3 hours on all these topics, but we all have other jobs. So this has been great to have you on talking about all things Azure and containers. And for those of you listening and watching right now, if I didn't get to your question, apologies. We just had so many questions today. It was actually great. Thank you all for being in chat and giving us some topics. And this show will come out as an audio podcast after it's been edited, probably a month or so from now. So below, you'll find all the links for following the show, for getting the newsletter about who's here every week. You'll find out when Brendan's going to be on the audio podcast in case you missed the show. You want to watch the edited down version where you take out all my ums. Essentially, that's basically what the podcast is taking out my stutters. And we will be here live. Actually, Matt and I will be back here next Thursday, and we'll be live again, and we'll be taking your questions again. We will unfortunately have Brendan. We don't have anyone that cool scheduled for next week, but
unless he wants to be.
On this note, yeah, this is only on the internet forever. So on the spot, yeah. Do you want to be our third host forever? Well,
I got a day job, sadly.
Yeah. I heard something about Azure.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't see each other again, I hope to see you at KubeCon. And for those on the internet, we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.